Hello and greetings from EnglishWise. I'm here today to help you prepare for your DSE Paper 4 group and individual discussion. So, shall we get started? Now, first of all, I should tell you that I've taught many students over the years how to prepare. And the first piece of advice I can tell you is to relax and to use what you've studied all these years in school. It's not that much different than when you participate in class discussions during school days, so no need to get all upset and nervous about it. Just calm down and relax, and I'm sure you're going to do quite well. So let's talk about the format. Now, I'm sure you have some indication from your English teacher, something about the format. But I want to give you some tips and strategies how you can utilize what you've already studied in terms of grammar, structure, vocabulary, and expressions, and put them to good use in the exam. After all, like I said, it's just testing you about things that you already know, so be calm and confident. Okay, so if we look at the format of the exam, you will get a passage that everyone will have 10 minutes to analyze. So while you can't write on the paper, you'll have some scratch paper, and go down before you read it and look at the questions or the areas that they suggest that your group discusses. So when you read it, you'll use your 10 minutes very wisely to read through and identify what points that you should be using for your discussion, because you don't want to get off on a tangent or perhaps not cover what you're meant to be covering. So no matter what the group size you have, you will all have 10 minutes. However, when it comes to the discussion time, sometimes you will have less time for discussion. So you may ask, why is that? Well, sometimes the student, for whatever reason, may not show up. So instead of having 4 students in your group, you may end up having only 3, in which case you will have a shorter time for discussion. Students ask me, is that any different? Well, you want to be able to be that much more prepared because you want to be able to cover all the points, but you only have 6 minutes to do it. So, there are some tips that we can give you, and I'm sure it will be in addition to what you've already heard and thought about the exam. Okay, so when you go through the passage, if you don't know a vocabulary word, you can try to think of it in the context of the rest of the passage and see if you can sort of guess it. Okay, but if you can't, then perhaps you won't be talking in that particular instance. Now, some students ask me, oh, should I be an eager beaver and be the first one to start talking? Or should I sort of sit back and let everyone else have their say and then I come up with something brilliant towards the end? Well, I would say if you're confident to start talking, if you're the first one to speak, you have an advantage because you can take the strongest point that you can make about the passage and you can get it out there. So you don't have to be sort of the third one to say, oh yeah, I agree with that, right? You can say something strong and very well defined. So as a general principle, I would say be the first one to start talking, if at all possible. Now that said, the examiners don't really like if there's a traffic jam, if everyone's trying to shout out something at once, because they're also giving you points on being cooperative and polite to your other testees. So when you're in your group, if someone else tries to take the first point, then okay, let them, but then you jump in the second point. Now you may find that you have some people in your group who their English standard might not be as good as yours. So either they're very reluctant to speak, and if they do speak, they just say yes, or I agree, or something like that. So it's your job to try to draw them out and to try to get them to be more participatory. And the way you do that is to ask questions that would inspire them to speak a bit more. Okay. And Another problem, which is probably even a bigger problem you may find, is that the other people in your group may not speak English that is decipherable. So you can't really understand what they're saying, or perhaps they speak so softly that you can't really even hear them. So you have to have a way to, especially if they ask you a question, you know, if they don't speak English properly and then they ask you a question, actually you don't really know what they're talking about. So your English may be really good, but you can't understand their question. I think the judges will take that into consideration, but you can ask them to perhaps restate it in another way, and then you can answer it. Okay, so I've given you some points about how to get started, right? So the judges like a very spirited discussion, looking at the pros and cons of the situation, and they don't really want any dead air. So you have to have a few points ready to move on if you find anyone's lagging or you get some dead air that you have to fill. Okay, so we're going to go and talk about some points, how to agree, how to disagree, how to state your opinions, and how to conclude. Because if the discussion is going nowhere and you're only covering the first point, you have to know how to get people back on track. So those are also strategies that you can learn. Now I'm going to give you a few suggestions, but mind you, you don't need to memorize everything. Just read through them and then see which one comes the most natural for you to use. So I suggest you maybe just memorize 2 or 3 in each category and have them sort of up your sleeve if you need them. And then you can just be more natural when you deliver them, and it won't sound very stilted or artificial. Because as I said, the examiners are looking for a very natural tone and feeling relaxed about it, right? So don't read from your paper. They're not really looking for that. Okay, so shall we get started with some of the tips that we're going to talk about today? So let's look at what we call soften. Smile, open your arms. You know, when you deliver a message like this, you look very negative and you don't look enthusiastic. So open your arms and look very welcoming and look very open to other students' ideas and suggestions. Okay, lean a bit forward. Remember, you're not in your living room sitting back and watching TV, right? Put your body a bit forward and look like you're really into it and following everyone's points very carefully. Okay, of course, it goes without saying, talk. This is not a time to be silent or be worried about what other people will think of you. Chances are you'll never see these people again, so just open your mouth and let it come out. Eye contact. This is one of the most important things that you must remember. Make eye contact. If you're playing what you're supposed to be doing, you probably are only speaking about 25% of the time, which means the other 75% of the time, you should kind of look around at the rest of your group and keep your eyes on the one who's speaking. And then it looks like you're interested and very in tune with what's going on. And nod. You can nod in agreement. Even sometimes you don't agree with what someone's saying, but you just nod as a kind of, I hear you, right? So in other words, if somebody says something I don't agree with, I will shake my head and then say, however, and then say my point, which is in disagreement. So nodding when you have a conversation just shows people that you're paying attention to what they're saying. Okay, so we call that the soften approach. So try to master that. All right, now let's talk about the group discussion. And I'm going to give you some useful expressions that you, as I said, you can read through them and then choose the ones that you feel you're most comfortable with. Okay, so first of all, when you express your view, okay, so now you have complete sharing with your group. So number 1, respond to and comment to other people's ideas. 2, your own argument or your own idea or concept. 3, elaboration, explanation. For example, you could give an example, or you could further elaborate on what the person who just spoke before you said. 2, a short conclusion. You can kind of tie up what you said or what the group said. And 5, asking for agreement or other ideas. So you can imagine that people wouldn't have all the same views as you. And even if you find your group has all the same views, mix it up a little bit. Maybe you can have another way of saying something just to get the conversation on track and moving along. Okay. So now let's talk about when you first present your idea for in the beginning. Okay. So you would say, I think, I believe, in my opinion, as I see it, as far as I'm concerned, from my point of view, from my perspective. So all these are giving your own opinion or from your own experience, okay? So you can use that when you present your idea. Now let's say that someone has already presented an idea or their own opinion. So now how do you show agreement? Here are some possible ways that you can show that you agree with them. You could say, I agree with you. That's exactly how I feel. That's so true. That's how I see it. I see what you're getting at. Precisely. Exactly. You took the words out of my mouth. My feelings exactly. You can say that again. I'll say, you hit the nail on the head. Spot on. So these are all different expressions to show your agreement. Okay. I agree with you. That's right. That's true. Very well said. That's a very interesting point you made. Okay. That's a good point. That sounds amazing. That sounds fabulous. I share the same view with you. Now, sometimes you disagree, or actually in your heart you don't really disagree, but you just want to show another side, right? So you could use expressions like this. I disagree with you. Well, from another perspective, I can see how you might view it that way. However, alternately, we could consider. While I'm sure many might agree with your view, I think that has a lot of merit, but could you consider? I get where you're coming from, but taking the other side for a moment, I can agree up to a point, but I don't entirely agree with you. I really don't go along with that because, however, it's questionable whether I respectfully disagree. I'm afraid I don't agree with you. I'm afraid that's not a reasonable idea. I'm afraid there are some drawbacks. I'm afraid I don't accept your point of view. I don't share the same ideas with you. I respect your point, but from my perspective, I take your point, but that isn't the way I see it. I understand where you're coming from, but true, that's a fair point. But I have to say I disagree because after you express your disagreement, you could add your own ideas. So for example, instead, I think we should, or I think we could. Okay, next. My suggestion would be to, okay. An alternative solution might be, I would recommend that we, how about if we, What do you think about instead? If you ask me, I think we should. Okay. Now, if you just want to elaborate on what someone has said, you can say things like, further to your point, an exception may be, in spite of, but we mustn't lose sight of the fact. The other thing we should keep in mind, just to wrap it up, perhaps the final word on this subject, just add to your stats. Just to add to your stats. Okay. Now, sometimes the conversation is getting bogged down on maybe the first point that you have at the bottom of the page of your reading passage. So how do we move things along? Because remember, you don't want to have dead air, and you don't want to keep saying the same things over and over again. Your team won't necessarily get a lot of points for that. So moving on, or transitional words you can use. We can all move on to the next topic smoothly by saying, it seems we've covered this point quite extensively. May I suggest moving on to the next topic, which is about, okay, it seems that we're going in circles. Shall we move on now? Or you can also add some other things that you may think of, such as, I think we should perhaps look at the second and third point that we at the bottom of the page. Shall we have a look at those and add our ideas on those? Well, I hope you've found the information I just gave you to be useful. And remember, if you prepare and you just relax that day, you'll do quite well. So the only thing left for me to say is goodbye and good luck.